You know, sometimes the most beautiful experiences begin without any planning at all. One morning I found myself feeling restless, as if the walls around me had started closing in. The weather outside was neither too warm nor too cold, but it carried a crisp freshness that whispered of open skies and distant shores. I didn't have any plans that day, no deadlines, no appointments, nothing pressing to hold me back. And that was when the idea suddenly came to me. Why not take a trip? Not a carefully arranged week's in the making holiday, but something spontaneous, something that would surprise even me. My mind wandered to a place I had heard of before, a small seaside town that seemed almost magical in the way people described it. Whitby. I had seen photographs of its picturesque harbor, its narrow winding streets, and that ancient abbey watching over the town from the hilltop. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the perfect escape. I didn't even pack much. Just the essentials, a warm scarf, my favorite notebook, and a good book for the journey. Within an hour I was on my way, leaving behind the familiar for something I couldn't fully picture yet, but somehow knew would be worth it. The journey itself felt like part of the adventure. As the train rolled out of the city, the scenery began to change. Gray buildings gave way to stretches of green fields and quiet countryside dotted with sheep grazing lazily. Every so often the tracks curved near a small village, and I'd catch a glimpse of stone cottages with smoke curling from their chimneys, almost like scenes from a painting. It was as though the further I traveled, the lighter I felt, as if each mile was quietly brushing away the weight of the ordinary. By the time the train reached the coast, I could smell the faint saltiness in the air. That scent, fresh, briny, and alive, seemed to call out a welcome even before I stepped onto Whitby's platform. I remember taking a deep breath as I got off the train, and in that moment it was as if my mind had been washed clean. The town unfolded before me like a story waiting to be told. I began to wander without any particular route in mind. The streets here were narrow and cobbled, lined with tiny shops that looked as though they had stood for centuries. Some sold handmade crafts, others displayed shelves full of second-hand books with worn spines and stories still eager to be read. I stopped at a bakery where the warm, buttery scent of freshly baked pastries spilled out into the street, and I couldn't resist buying a flaky pasty that practically melted in my mouth as I ate it walking along. Every turn revealed something new, a hidden alleyway that opened onto a quiet courtyard, a fisherman mending his nets by the harbor, humming to himself as the gulls wheeled and cried overhead. The sunlight danced on the water, scattering patterns of gold and silver as the tide moved gently against the wooden piers. I lingered there for a while, just watching the rhythm of the sea, feeling time slow down in a way it rarely does. It struck me how different everything felt compared to the rush of everyday life. Here no one seemed to be in a hurry. People greeted each other in passing. Strangers exchanged smiles without hesitation, and there was an unspoken understanding that this was a place to breathe, to savor. It was as if wit by itself carried an old, quiet wisdom, an invitation to let go of what didn't matter and to notice what did. As the afternoon light softened, I climbed the famous 199 steps leading up to the abbey. Each step gave me a slightly higher view of the town, until the rooftops, the harbor, and the vast sweep of the sea all lay beneath me. Standing there at the top, the wind carrying the scent of the ocean and the faint sound of waves, I felt a deep sense of stillness. Not the kind that comes from silence alone, but the kind that fills you from the inside out, making you aware of your own breath, your own place in the world. That day I hadn't gone looking for anything in particular. I just wanted a change of scene. But Whitby gave me far more than that. It gave me a sense of freedom, of stepping outside the familiar and being reminded that beauty often comes when you least expect it. It reminded me that sometimes all it takes is a single decision, a willingness to go where the day leads you, to find yourself in a place that feels like it's been waiting for you all along. And that is how a simple, unplanned trip became one of the most memorable days of my life. The moment my feet touched those cobbled streets, it felt like stepping into another time. The stones beneath me were uneven and worn, shaped by centuries of footsteps, each one carrying its own untold story. I could hear the soft, satisfying click of my shoes against them as I walked, the sound blending with the hum of voices, the occasional bark of a dog, and the distant call of gulls circling above. There was something comforting about the way the streets curved and narrowed, almost as if they were guiding me, gently pulling me toward the heart of the town. Shops and houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their walls close enough to cast cool shadows across the path. Many of the buildings leaned slightly, their age showing not in decay, but in character. Painted doors in faded blues and greens, windows dressed with lace curtains that stirred in the breeze. Small signs swung gently above doorways, announcing bakeries, bookshops, and little cafes where the smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread spilled out into the air. I slowed my pace because here there was no need to rush. The streets seemed to ask you to notice them, to take in every detail. The further I wandered, the more I realized these streets were alive with a kind of quiet charm. There were artists sketching on benches, their pads balanced on their knees, and couples walking hand in hand, pausing to look at something in a shop window. I passed a tiny sweet shop, the kind with large glass jars of brightly closured candies lined neatly on the shelves, and outside it a little boy pressed his face to the glass with the same awe as if he were staring at a treasure chest. It wasn't long before the narrow streets began to open up, and the air took on a sharper, saltier edge. I followed the sound of the water, gentle but insistent, until suddenly the harbor came into view. It was as though the whole town had been leading me here, to this wide, open space where the sea met the shore. The water was calm, its surface broken only by the slow bobbing of fishing boats tethered to the docks. Their hulls were painted in bright reds, yellows, and blues, some chipped and weathered from years of service, yet still proud in the sunlight. The harbor was alive with its own rhythm. Fishermen moved with steady, practiced motions, unloading their nets and checking their gear. Seagulls swooped low, hopeful for scraps, their calls echoing across the water. There was the faint metallic scent of the sea mixed with the aroma of fried fish from a small shop tucked near the pier. I stood there for a while, just watching the way the light shifted on the water, turning it from deep blue to shimmering silver in an instant. Walking along the edge of the harbor, I noticed how the reflections of the buildings and boats danced with the ripples. Every now and then, a breeze would ruffle the surface, blurring those shapes before they reformed again, as if the sea itself was painting and repainting the scene. People were gathered in small groups, some sitting on benches with paper-wrapped fish and chips, others leaning against the railings, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky seemed to melt into the water. There was a certain peace in that harbor, even with the quiet bustle of activity. It felt like a place where time slowed just enough for you to breathe deeply and see clearly. I found myself tracing the lines of the boats with my eyes, noticing the small details. The ropes neatly coiled on the deck, the names painted on the sides, the way the sunlight caught on the curve of the bow. It was in these simple moments, surrounded by the mix of sea air, gentle sounds, and warm sunlight, that the beauty of the place truly settled into me. I wandered further along, crossing a small wooden bridge that connected one side of the harbor to the other. From there the view opened up completely. You could see the whole curve of the shoreline, the cluster of houses climbing the hill, and beyond that, the endless stretch of the North Sea. The waves out there moved with more energy, their white tips catching the sun as they rolled toward the shore. Standing there, I couldn't help but feel a quiet connection, not just to the town, but to everyone who had walked these streets and stood by this harbor before me. By the time I turned back toward the cobbled streets, I realized I had lost all sense of the hours passing. The streets and harbor together had created something unforgettable, a perfect blend of history, life, and nature. It wasn't just a place to see, it was a place to feel. The first thing that struck me as I made my way closer to the open water was the smell. It wasn't just the sharp tang of salt that you get near the coast. It was something deeper, richer, and far more alive. The air carried the scent of the seaweed clinging to the rocks, of the cool spray drifting off the waves, and even a faint trace of fresh fish from the boats moored nearby. Every breath seemed to reach right down into me, clearing out the heaviness of the everyday and replacing it with a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as though the sea itself was saying, "Here, this is for you, take as much as you need." As I stood there breathing it in, the sound of seagulls surrounded me. It wasn't a quiet backdrop, but a lively, almost musical layer to the entire scene. Their cries were sharp and playful, sometimes overlapping, sometimes echoing across the harbor. I could hear them wheeling high above, the rush of their wings cutting through the air before they circled back toward the water. Every now and then one would swoop low, its feathers catching the sunlight so that for a split second it seemed almost silver. They were everywhere, esting on the rooftops, gliding over the waves, perched on the railings as if keeping watch over the comings and goings of the town. The combination of that smell and sound created something I can only describe as a kind of awakening. With each step closer to the shore, I became more aware of the details around me. The tide was moving in slowly, nudging small waves up against the stones. I could see the foam curling and breaking in delicate patterns before disappearing into the pull of the next wave. The breeze carried with it tiny drops of sea spray that landed on my cheeks, cool and refreshing, and I couldn't help but close my eyes for a moment to let it all sink in. When I opened them again, I noticed the gulls weren't just noise in the distance. They were part of the life here. Some were clustered on the beach, poking at the sand for hidden morsels, while others hovered over the fishermen's nets, hoping for an easy snack. I watched one bold bird hop right up to a man eating chips on a bench, clearly confident that it might claim a bite if he wasn't paying attention. He laughed and waved it away, but not unkindly, and the gull simply moved on to try its luck elsewhere. The smell seemed to shift slightly as I walked along the harbor wall, taking on a cleaner, sharper edge when the wind came straight off the open water. It was impossible not to fill my lungs with it again and again, as though I could store it somehow for later. That scent held a promise. It spoke of freedom, of wide horizons, of places beyond the line where the sky met the sea. And paired with the gull's constant chatter, it was like the soundtrack to something wild and untamed, yet also deeply familiar. I found a spot near the edge of the pier where I could sit and just watch. The gulls glided effortlessly, sometimes letting the wind carry them without a single flap of their wings. Their calls varied, some short and sharp, others long and drawn out, almost like they were calling to each other across invisible distances. There was a rhythm to it, one that matched the slow push and pull of the tide. For a while I forgot about everything else, the shops, the people, even the town itself. and just focused on the meeting point of air, sea, and sound. The longer I stayed there, the more I understood why this smell and sound combination is so deeply etched in the memories of anyone who loves the sea. It's not just about what you're sensing in that moment, it's about how it makes you feel. There's an openness in it, a reminder that the world is bigger than the small concerns we carry with us each day. The gulls seem to know it too. They live between the two worlds, land and water, at home in both but bound to neither. In their cries I heard something that felt like joy, or maybe just the simple contentment of existing exactly where they were meant to be. By the time I stood up to leave, the tide had shifted again, and the air carried a slightly stronger scent of salt, mixing with the warmth of the afternoon sun. The gulls followed me in the distance, their voices fading only when I stepped back into the shelter of the narrow streets. Yet even there, the freshness of the sea clung to me as if refusing to be left behind. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest details, the smell in the air, the sound above, can be the things that stay with you long after you've gone. One of the things that surprised me most about my time in Whitby was how quickly the people there made me feel like I belonged. It didn't take much, just a smile here, a friendly nod there, and suddenly I was no longer just a visitor passing through, but someone they seemed genuinely happy to see. From the moment I wandered into the little cafe by the harbor, the warmth of the locals was as real as the steam rising from the mugs of tea they served. The woman behind the counter greeted me as if I were an old friend she hadn't seen in a while, asking where I'd come from and what had brought me to Whitby. I didn't have much of an answer, only that I'd come on a whim, but she smiled as though that was the best reason of all. I sat by the window with my tea and a slice of lemon drizzle cake, listening to the gentle hum of conversation around me. The people here spoke with that melodic Yorkshire lilt, and there was something comforting about the way they shared words with each other, not rushed, not distracted, but full of attention and interest. At the table next to mine, two older men were discussing the weather in great detail, but it was more than just small talk. They were swapping stories about the sea, remembering storms and bright sunny days, their laughter filling the space between sips of tea. Later, as I wandered through the market stalls set up along the street, I found myself drawn into conversations without even trying. One stall sold handmade jeweler crafted from bits of sea glass and polished stones, each piece carrying the soft colors of the shore. The woman running it told me about how she collected the glass early in the mornings, before the town woke up, combing the beach for pieces the tide had smoothed overnight. Her eyes lit up as she spoke, and I realized it wasn't just the jeweler she was sharing. It was the story behind it, the life that went into every fragment. It wasn't only the shopkeepers or market sellers who were open and kind. Even people passing by seemed ready to stop for a quick word. I remember pausing near the harbor to watch a fisherman fixing his nets. Without looking up, he started telling me about how the catch had been lately, how the sea had been calmer than usual, and how he could smell rain in the air. I hadn't asked, he simply seemed to know I'd be happy to listen, and I was. There was a rhythm to his voice, the kind that comes from years of telling stories, and I found myself holding onto every word. Walking further into the old part of the town, I discovered a tiny bookshop tucked between two taller buildings. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust, and the man at the counter looked up with a warm grin. He didn't just point me toward the shelves. He began recommending books set in Whitby, weaving in tales of local history, ghost stories, and legends that gave the town its character. It was as though each book was a doorway to another layer of the place, and he wanted me to see it all. What struck me most was how easily people here shared themselves. not just their stories, but their time, their attention, their smiles. There was no sense of hurry, no feeling that these interactions were something extra they were squeezing into their day. It was simply the way things were. If you stopped to talk, you stayed until the story was done. If you passed someone on the street, you exchanged a smile as naturally as breathing. It was the kind of warmth that didn't feel put on for visitors. It felt genuine, lived in, and deeply rooted in the way the town existed. As the day wore on, I realized how these small moments had shaped my time in Whit by as much as the sights and the scenery. Yes, the harbor was beautiful, the streets were charming, and the sea was unforgettable, but it was the people who had given the place its heartbeat. Their friendliness didn't just make me feel welcome, it made me feel connected, as if I had stepped into a community that valued not just the place they lived in, but the people they shared it with. When I finally left, it wasn't the buildings or even the sea air I carried with me most vividly. It was the memory of those faces, those voices, those small but lasting connections. Some of the best parts of my time in Whitby weren't the well-known landmarks or the bustling streets. They were the quiet little corners I stumbled upon when I wasn't even looking. It's funny how you can set out to see one thing and end up discovering something entirely unexpected, something that feels like it's been waiting just for you. That's how it was here. I would turn down a narrow lane or follow a path that seemed to lead nowhere, only to find myself in a spot so peaceful that the rest of the world seemed to slip away. One afternoon, I wandered away from the harbor, letting my feet take me wherever they wanted. The sounds of the crowds and the gulls began to fade, replaced by the gentle whisper of the wind. I found a small passage between two stone cottages, barely wide enough for me to walk through, its cobblestones damp and glistening in the soft light. At the end of it, there was a little courtyard with a single wooden bench, framed by climbing roses, and a low wall that looked out toward the sea. It was completely hidden from the main streets, and for a while I had it entirely to myself. The view was the kind that makes you pause without thinking. A stretch of water meeting the horizon, the sunlight breaking through clouds in streaks of silver and gold. Later, I decided to explore one of the paths that wound up the hillside. It wasn't part of any map I'd seen, just a narrow track lined with wildflowers swaying in the breeze. The climb was slow, but with each step, the view below opened wider. The rooftops of the town, the curve of the harbor, the endless sweep of the coastline. When I reached a small clearing, I realized I could see for miles. The sea shimmered in the distance, dotted with the tiny shapes of boats, and the air was so still that I could hear the faint sound of waves rolling against the shore far below. It was one of those moments where you feel entirely present, as if nothing else exists outside of what's in front of you. Even in the busier parts of Whitby, there were tucked away places that felt untouched. Down by the harbor wall, I found a set of worn stone steps leading to a narrow strip of beach. The tide was out, leaving behind pools of water where tiny crabs scuttled under smooth pebbles. Seaweed clung to the rocks in shades of green so vivid they seemed almost unreal. There was no one else there, just the quiet lapping of the water and the occasional cry of a gull drifting from somewhere above. I sat on the stones and let the sound of the sea fill the space around me, feeling a calm I didn't even realize I'd been missing. One evening, as the light began to fade, I came across a small path behind the abbey. It curved gently downward, leading to a spot where the grass dipped into a natural hollow. From there, I could watch the sun setting over the town, the rooftops glowing in warm shades of amber and red. The sky seemed to change every second, soft blues giving way to pink, then deepening into purples and golds. The air grew cooler, and with it came that familiar salty scent, mingling with the earthy smell of the grass around me. It was quiet apart from the distant murmur of the sea, and in that stillness the whole world seemed to hold its breath. I think that's what made these hidden places so special, the sense that they weren't meant to impress with grandeur or scale, but to offer you a moment just for yourself. They didn't demand anything from you. They simply invited you to stop, to notice, to let your mind rest. In those moments, it didn't matter what I'd come to Whitby expecting to see. The real treasures were these small discoveries, the places I hadn't read about in guidebooks, the views no one else was crowding around to photograph. By the time I left, I realized that these peaceful spots had shaped my memory of the trip more than anything else. They were the moments where I truly felt the heart of the place, not in its busiest streets, but in its quiet, hidden corners. From the moment the day began, there was a feeling in the air that it would be something special. The sky had that pale, early morning light that makes everything seem gentle, and the town was just waking up. I started slowly, taking in the freshness of the sea breeze, letting myself settle into the rhythm of the place. It didn't take long before the day began to fill with moments that would stay with me, some planned, some completely unexpected. I learned more than I thought I would, not from books or signs, but from the people and the place itself. Strolling through the market, I stopped at a stall selling fresh seafood. The man behind it, his hands weathered from years on the water, began telling me about the tides, the seasons, and how each one brought a different kind of catch. He spoke with such pride, his words painting a picture of the life he led. I realized then how much of a place you can understand simply by listening to those who belong to it. Every conversation seemed to add another layer to my understanding of Whitby, its history, its traditions, and the small details that make it what it is. And then there was the laughter. It came easily throughout the day, bubbling up in moments I didn't see coming. I laughed with a group of children feeding chips to the gulls by the harbor, their squeals echoing across the water whenever a bold bird swooped in too close. I laughed with a shopkeeper who joked about how quickly the weather could change, only for the sun to vanish behind a cloud as if to prove his point. Even when I found myself caught in a brief, unexpected shower, I couldn't help but smile at the way everyone else simply carried on, umbrellas popping open like flowers in the rain. There was a sense of lightness everywhere I went, the kind that comes when you let yourself be fully present. At one point, I joined a small walking tour through the older part of town. The guide, with a twinkle in his eye, told stories of smugglers, ghostly sightings, and sailors who'd brought back strange treasures from faraway lands. Some of the tales were surely more legend than fact, but that was part of the fun. The group laughed together, strangers at first, but slowly warming to each other as the walk went on. In between the learning and the laughter, there were moments of quiet reflection that settled deep inside me. Sitting on a bench overlooking the harbor, I watched as the afternoon sun turned the water a soft, golden hue. Boats moved lazily in and out, their reflections rippling on the surface. People strolled past, some deep in conversation, others simply enjoying the day. It was the kind of peaceful scene that stays with you, not because it's grand or dramatic, but because it feels so complete. Food became another part of the day's memories. I tried fish and chips from a little shop the locals swore by, the batter crisp and light, the fish fresh and tender. Sitting outside, I could taste the salt in the air mingling with the flavor of the meal, and it felt like exactly the right thing to be eating in that moment. Later, I ducked into a small terroom for a pot of tea and a scone, the kind that crumbles perfectly under your knife. The woman who served me asked about my day, and when I told her, she nodded knowingly, as if to say that yes, Whitby has that effect on people. By the time evening arrived, the town had taken on a softer mood. Lights began to glow in the windows, and the sky shifted into deep blues and purples. I walked along the pier, listening to the gentle hush of the waves. Around me, Couples leaned into each other, families gathered for one last photo, and friends lingered over the last of their conversations. I realized that the day had been a blend of so many simple, perfect things: kind words, shared stories, good food, unexpected laughs, and those small moments when you catch yourself thinking, "I'm glad I'm here." It was the kind of day that doesn't just pass, it stays with you, quietly becoming part of who you are. It's amazing to think how much can fit into a single day when you open yourself to it. What began as an unexpected journey to a small seaside town turned into something far richer than I could have imagined. I wandered along cobbled streets that seemed to hold the footsteps of centuries, stood by the harbor with its calm waters and colorful boats, and breathed in the fresh smell of the sea while the sound of seagulls filled the air above me. I met people whose warmth could brighten even the grayest sky, locals who shared their stories with such ease, smiles that felt like they belonged to old friends. I found hidden spots where the noise of the world couldn't reach me, places where the view stretched so far it felt like it belonged only to that moment. And throughout it all, there was laughter, small lessons, and the kind of memories you don't just collect, you carry. Leaving Whitby, I realized it wasn't only about what I had seen, but about what I had felt. This place has a way of weaving itself into you, of reminding you that beauty is often found in the quiet, unexpected spaces between one moment and the next. And as I go, I take with me the sights, the sounds, the stories, and above all, the feeling that some journeys don't just take you somewhere new. They bring you home in a way you didn't know you needed.